A warm welcome to everyone at Ultimate Meaning, the Theory of Samsara. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Lama Tsultrim. He's a Canadian monk who has been engaged in the spiritual path since the 1950s. Now, Lama Tsultrim, as I understand it, then you came to the spiritual path at a very young age when you were only 13, and also in the 1950s in Canada. Specifically, it started in Edmonton, Alberta, which is also my hometown, and I was quite surprised when I heard that. Because when I was a young boy, I never even met a Buddhist and rarely met anyone who wasn't a Christian. Can you tell us a little bit about how it is you came to the spiritual path? What was the sort of impetus that started you on the way?
When my father died, I was about 13. This was in the fall of 1957. And as I was contemplating his death, it occurred to me that it was like there was a black curtain and he was somewhere behind that. Yeah. And I couldn't see through it, and it was just a complete mystery, and it fascinated me. So I contemplated that quite intensively all day, every day for a few weeks, and then one day there was a realization, and the realization had a whole lot of things in it, and it was quite profound, but part of it was that I saw absolutely clearly that I and everyone else was going to die.
Wow. Yeah.
And at 13, death is not that real to you, you know.
It certainly wasn't real to me when I was 13.
No, you know in your head that everybody's going to die, but in your heart you believe it's just old people and people you don't know, you know. After that, I noticed that everyone I came in contact with, including the minister from the church who had done the funeral, went back to engaging in very meaningless activities. And it struck me that they must not really know that they're going to die in the way that I had been shown, because otherwise they wouldn't do those things, you know. So I began to wonder whether there was any meaning in life, or whether this was just it. You fool around, do meaningless things, and then you die. And what's the point of it, you know? Oh, and if I tried to talk to anybody about it, it just got nowhere. There was absolutely nobody that I could talk to any of this. So on my own, I took a vow that I would not forget this valuable lesson, and that I would contemplate death every day, and that I would also look for meaning in life. Just because the people I knew were doing things that were meaningless didn't mean there wasn't meaning out there somewhere.
Right.
It just wasn't apparent to me what it was. Every single person I met, every single thing I studied at school, every place I went, every movie I watched, I was always watching them to see if there was any sign anywhere that somebody knew something about the meaning of life. And I didn't find it. When I was 16, I went to university, and I thought, you know, some of the professors might know something, you know, because they're pretty learned, and I didn't see any meaning there. Everywhere I went, there was just no sign of that anybody knew anything, and that there was no sign of meaning in life. I dropped out of university and wandered quite a bit. And at one point, I wound up in Washington, D.C., where the Smithsonian Institution was. It consists of a whole lot of museums that basically cover everything, the entire history of the planet and the solar system, the entire history and all activities of human beings, and lots about animals and so on. So I spent quite a long time there, and I went through every single exhibit in every single museum and looked at each exhibit to see whether there was any sign of any meaning in life. And I didn't find it. So I had pretty much reached the end, and I wandered back, and I wandered back to Canada, and I went to Vancouver. I was in Stanley Park by the ocean at sunset. And I was sitting there watching the beauty, and all of a sudden I had another realization that seemed very profound and very deep in many ways. And the realization was that life as I knew it cannot and will not produce anything meaningful. Partly because everything is temporary. Even if you get a lot of money, eventually you die, you can't take it with you. Even if I had different circumstances in life, like more money or a nice car or a girlfriend or something, there would be no possibility of any meaning. Life would be different, but still meaningless.
Meaningless. How old were you at that time?
I would have just turned, I think, 23.
Wow.
So it was 10 years of contemplation, death, and meaning of life.
Since you were a young boy at the age of 13, contemplating the death of your father up till then.
Yeah, and so it was 10 years of contemplating death and looking for meaning in life everywhere, all day, every day. When I had this realization, part of it was that a dropping out happened. In ordinary language, one would say, I simply dropped out of society, but really it just happened on its own. And I found I could no longer cooperate with life as I knew it. And so I completely abandoned all goals like getting a job or getting a girlfriend or whatever. And I just assumed that I would starve to death. And because I wasn't going to work anymore.
Right, yeah.
And the phrase that was there was, I will live like that unless something new and different comes along.
Right.
And I had never come across anything that would fulfill that criteria.
You'd sort of given up hope on ever finding something else.
Their hope was absolutely, totally gone. There was no hope. So a very strange thing happened. The day after that realization, my subjective experience was that the universe took me in its hands to look after me. And so all fear disappeared about starving to death because I was being taken care of. A few days later, somebody offered me a free place to stay. I had helped them once in the past in a major way, and so they gave me a free place to stay, including food.
Food as well.
If I wanted, yeah. And then the very few people that I knew in Vancouver all started inviting me for meals all the time. A couple approached me. I'd met the woman once. I'd never met the man. And they knew I wasn't working, but I had a car, and they asked me if I would drive the woman across the country, and they would pay all the expenses. And I thought, well, yeah, I can die of starvation in Toronto just as good as in Vancouver, you know. After I was established in this free place to stay, one night I had an extremely vivid dream, which I can still remember every single part of it to this day.
Wow.
And in that dream, I was being hassled on all sides in a dream, and I woke up from that dream into another dream. And in the second dream, I was sleeping on the ground beside a lake in the mountains, and everything was very pristine and pure. And a friend of mine woke me up and said, wake up, the guide is here, it's time to start. And so I stood up, looked around. We were high in the mountains, and there was a man there wearing a very nondescript brown robe. And I said, are you the guide? And he nodded. And I said, where is it we're going? So we were in a shallow valley right beside a pristine lake. And off on over the hills was a path. And he pointed to that path. And in the distance, where that path was headed, there was a range of mountains. And then beyond that, a taller range of mountains. And beyond that, a really tall range of mountains that had just received fresh snow. And so he gestured with his arm that we're going to those mountains, the distant ones. And just as he did that, the sun came out on them, and they were just the purest white you could ever imagine, you know? And then I woke up. So when this couple got me to drive this woman across the country, we wound up in Toronto, and she went and stayed with her aunt. And I knew one friend there that I had met earlier in life, and so I went and asked him if I could stay with them. I said, by the way, I don't have any money and I don't plan to work, you know, so I hope you feed me. And he said, no problem, but I've met an enlightened being and I'd like you to meet him.
What?
Yeah, well, what's that, you know? So I didn't really want to meet anybody, but he insisted, and he looked after me, you know, and fed me and gave me a place to sleep, and so on Monday morning, I was taken to an apartment where a man they called Anandabodhi was going to give a talk. And that was the name of Namgyal Rinpoche when he was a Theravada monk.
Okay, yeah.
And he had not yet met the Karmapa. And so we went into the apartment where he's given the talk, and the floor was all filled with people, but over on the far side, near the dining room, there was a little space on the floor. So I started picking my way through there to go find a place to sit. And at one point, I looked up and I saw this man sitting in an easy chair, and he was staring right at me, and when our eyes met, he winked. And he was the guy from the dream. Something happened to me, and I instantly knew this was something new and different. And I also knew at that moment, whatever he was teaching was what I'd been looking for my whole life. So I knew instantly that this is for me. And
what year was this? It was 1960?
67, February 67.
And how did Anandabodhi come to take vows in the Theravadic tradition? It was very early on in Canada, wasn't it?
When he was a young man, I believe he went to a university in the States to study comparative religion, but he was also interested in politics, and so he moved to England, and where his interest in politics disappeared. And he met Uttulawanta, the great Burmese master, and asked for ordination. And so Uttulawanta said, well, I'll give you the Samanera ordination in Bodh Gaya, but the full bhikshu ordination will have to be in Burma.
Right.
So he made his way to Bodh Gaya, and the story is that Uttulawanta, after the ordination, took away his money and passport and said, I'll meet you in Rangoon, you know?
Yeah.
And he somehow had to walk there without
So he had to travel from northern India all the way to Burma in order to take his vows.
I wasn't with him at the time, so I don't know all of that, but that's a story that's around.
Amazing.
So he ordained there, and he did Vipassana for a long time. Then the Burmese government clamped down, and he had to leave the country, so he moved to Thailand. While he was in Thailand, at some point, he was invited by some British Buddhists in London, and they brought him to London to teach. But they didn't treat him very well. They made him sleep on the kitchen floor and things like that, you know. He bought an old hunting lodge called Johnson House.
Oh, Johnson House. Oh,
yeah, which he gave to Trungpa. When Trungpa came along.
It is now Sammy Ling.
I'm
going there this next week.
Are you?
Yeah.
Once I found out about enlightenment, and that enlightenment, among other things, takes you beyond suffering, then my whole life was, I want that.
Right.
And I'm not interested in anything else. Mm-hmm. My plan, starting at that time, was, I want full enlightenment by Tuesday at the latest. And that's exactly everybody's reaction. They all thought I was crazy.
But that's uncontrived renunciation, right? This desire to be free from samsara.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So
that's why people think you're crazy, because most people don't have this. So
there wasn't a single other person in his group who wanted enlightenment soon.
So badly.
For them, it was just coast along, do your hour of meditation a day, and then something will happen in the future. But I had that urgency, which later on I discovered that the Buddha called lack of that urgency is a fault.
Yep.
You know. At one point, he was going to go to India and take most of his students with him. And it was on that journey that he met the Karmapa and was recognized as Namgyal Rinpoche.
16th Karmapa, right? Yeah.
16th, yeah. And but most of his students who didn't go were content to just hang out and maybe do a little meditation. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to practice full time.
Yeah.
So I saw him, and he recommended I go to Thailand because he thought Japan would be too strict and disciplinary for me. And Thailand would let you go at your own speed, which he knew for me was quite slow, because I wasn't a very good meditator. And so I went to Thailand.
Can you tell me, what meditation were you doing at that time? You said you weren't a very good meditator, but what kind of practice were you doing?
The first meditation that Namgyal taught me was counting the breaths.
Okay.
And so you're supposed to go like 1, 2, up to 10, and then start at 1 again. Mm-hmm. But I would start doing that, and I would sort of space out, and I'd hear myself saying 172, 173. So I'd completely forgot what I was doing and was just automatically counting. Then we switched to Theravada Vipassana.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain a little bit about what this Theravada Vipassana is?
It's mindfulness of breathing. Mm-hmm. You focus on the rising and falling of the belly with respiration. And then when something arises that takes you away from that, like you hear a sound or you have an itch or something, you focus briefly on that and then go back to the rising and falling.
Mm-hmm. So he thought that the Japanese tradition would be just too difficult for you because it's like too strict.
Oh, absolutely. Way too difficult.
This is something I think a lot of people get confused about. They think the Japanese Zen is just about doing nothing and taking it easy.
Yeah.
Like the lazy way to enlightenment. But as far as I know, the Koreans and the Japanese are very diligent.
When Namgyal recommended I go to Thailand and become a monk, it never occurred to me to ask, well, what teacher should I go to? Where should I live? Uh-huh. I was trying to save up money to go there, and I was working for, I don't know if they had minimum wage in those days, but I mean, I was working at a job that paid almost nothing.
Yeah.
And airfares were very high. It was $700 one way, Toronto to Bangkok.
Wow.
In those days.
This is in the 60s.
I was making, in the 60s.
Wow, that's a fortune.
And I was making $200 a month and had to support myself in Toronto, Finally, I got some money together and decided to leave. My very ignorant plan was to fly to Scotland because that was the cheapest place, and then hitchhike to India. When I hitchhiked down from Scotland and I got into London, I found a cheap hotel. All night long, when I tried to sleep, there was a voice in my head that said, "You will not leave Bangkok without seeing Dear Wamsa." Now, Dear Wamsa was a Thai monk who had been living in London about 15 years. And previously, in the previous summer, Namgyal had invited him to Toronto to teach us Vipassana. And so I had met him. And I'm going to Thailand, and he's a Thai monk, you know, so I thought, well, maybe I can ask for a letter of reference for a visa or something like that. Oh, the reason I was going to hitchhike to India was I wanted to find Namgyal and ask him where to go in Thailand, because I wasn't going to have enough money to stay in a hotel and look around, you know. Mm-hmm. So I met Dear Wamsa, and it turned out that for the first time in 15 years, he was going back to Thailand the following week, exactly a week from the day I met him. And he offered to take me to his teacher.
Wow.
And that would solve everything, you know. Mm. And the fact that Namgyal had invited him, it seemed like that's a pretty good connection.
Yeah.
I got just enough money to buy the ticket. I was living in London in a very cheap hotel, 50 cents a night actually at the time. And I had no food for about 4 days. And I was really afraid there was going to be like some extra fees or a taxi to the airport or some expenses at the other end. And I didn't have a penny. And I didn't have the ability to just go talk to him and tell him what's what.
Yeah.
And he'd say, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it," you know. So the Thai embassy sent a limousine to drive us to the airport, no charge. And so we got on the plane and flew to Bangkok. The airport was run by an Air Force general because it was a military government. Mm. And Dear Wamsa was quite famous in Thailand, so he invited us for a meal. Then there was a 10-cent baggage fee, but they wouldn't charge me because I was with the general. And then the general,
you know, isn't it?
And then the general decided to personally drive us to the monastery, you know. So we got to the monastery, and I was wearing heavy corduroy pants and big work boots and big wool socks and very heavy shirt, because I'd been going to hitchhike over the Khyber Pass in the winter, you know, and I needed warm clothes. So when we got there, I was just about dying from the heat. It was 100 degrees and close to 100% humidity. Anyhow, after a while, his teacher, Dear Wamsa's teacher, showed up and agreed to take me as a student, told me to rest for a few days because of the jet lag, and when I was ready, we'll get going. And then I was taken up and given a bed in a room. And the monk who took me up spoke some English, and so when we got up there, it was a big room with 2 beds in it, and the other one was occupied, and he said, "This will be your bed." And I said, "Did you ever happen to know a Canadian monk named Anandabodhi?" And he said, "Oh yes, he lived here for some years. This was his bed, the one I'd just been assigned to."
How long did you spend in Thailand?
2 years.
2 years, okay.
Yeah.
And I understand that you took vows and robes at that time. Was that right?
Yeah.
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 What kind of inspired you to take vows? Was it your renunciation, or?
I didn't really know anything about how things work in Buddhism or the spiritual path. But if you took robes, then you were supported and you were free to meditate. Mm-hmm. And there was very little in the way of other responsibilities, you know.
Mm-hmm. So you could just focus on your practice.
Yeah.
And how did your meditation go?
Terrible. My mind was so busy that I couldn't ever get a gap to focus on the rising and falling of the breath, because it was just like one thought after another. in the 2 years, I really only had one good period where that settled down. A very vague message arrived in Bangkok, not addressed to anybody, and said to be from Namgyal Rinpoche, that it would be a good time to go to India and find our Tibetan teacher.
Oh.
And I didn't know I needed a Tibetan teacher. I was very happy in Thailand. There were a few monks in Thailand that knew Namgyal Rinpoche, and everybody contemplated whether that meant they should go, you know. And 3 of us decided yes, the rest of them no. So the 3 of us went. And we arrived in Calcutta. We stayed at the Mahabodhi Society. Mm-hmm. And we arrived there on December 30th, 1968.
1968. Must have been a different world back then.
Yeah, it was. And so the second day we were there, the old Sri Lankan monk who ran the place took us aside and said, "So what are you guys really doing here in India, you know?" And so we said, well, our Theravada teacher, Anandabodhi, told us to find a Tibetan teacher. And if you say that in Thailand at the time, they would react negatively, so we didn't know what he would do.
Right.
But he said, oh, that's a good idea, and if you're going to find a Tibetan teacher, you should find the Karmapa. And then he spoke for 20 minutes telling us why the Karmapa was the best Tibetan teacher, you know. And he said, well, he lives in Sikkim, and because of the recent war with China, they're not letting foreigners in there right now. But you don't have to go to Sikkim. He's in Calcutta today. He's a friend of mine. Would you like to meet him? So we jumped in a taxi, and 20 minutes later, we're bowing and asking the Karmapa to be our teacher. And he said, I will be your teacher. And if you come to his monastery in Sikkim,
Rumtek,
he will look after us, meaning he would give us a place and feed us.
Wow.
You know? But he said, I don't think you'll get there because they're not allowing anybody in. And so we spent 6 months trying to get there. We went to all the holy places, but we never got there.
Yeah.
But at least we had the Karmapa as our teacher, although I never really understood the importance of that for many decades.
And so when did you return to the West?
So after about 2 years of insight meditation, I was sitting in meditation one day, and my subjective experience was an out loud voice that sort of came from here somewhere, said out loud, it won't work. Oh, really? What won't work? Yeah. Now, when I had gone to Thailand, I brought all my delusions with me, and one of them was that, Namgyal was not very old. He was in his 30s when he was teaching. And he appeared to be fully enlightened. Mm-hmm. So my view of how hard it was to get enlightened was, like next Tuesday is reasonable. It can't be that hard, And I thought you just meditate, and then one day something miraculous happens and you awaken.
Yeah.
And so I had no realistic idea what was really involved. And so it was that plan that wouldn't work.
I see, yeah.
This voice said, right now, you're blocked in meditation. And what I had subtly done, and I think a lot of people do in meditation, is I had put in subtle controls so that there really weren't any surprises. You didn't, the fear of the unknown was there, and so you do it, but you're really just rehashing the same stuff all the time, and it's not going anywhere. So then I asked, well, what? So he said I'm blocked in meditation, so I said, what do I need to do to unblock? And he gave me the worst news ever. He said, You have to stop being a monk and go back to your own culture and grow up.
Really? Wow.
Now, I had not grown up normally when I was contemplating death every day.
Right, yeah.
If there was a girl that I was interested in, rather than go talk to her or ask her out or something, what would go through my mind was, well, yeah, I could do that, but even if it worked out and we fell in love and got married and raised a family, we're still going to die. So what's the point? I really had not had anywhere near a normal experience of growing up. And I didn't want to go back and live in the world. I wanted to stay being a monk. I loved being a monk.
Yeah.
And I had absolutely no problem with the vows and stuff like that. I actually experienced the vows as a Theravada monk in a, as far as I could tell, a unique way.
Right.
There was about 10 to 15 Westerners who were monks in Thailand in the whole country, and I knew most of them. And they all experienced the vows as you can't do this, you can't do that. And I experienced the vows as I'm free from having to do that. So as a young single man, if a woman walks into the room, it's sort of your duty to check things out and see, is this my partner or whatever. And so now I was free from that. If a woman walks into the room, I don't have to do anything. And I don't have to work to make a living, and I don't have to pay taxes, and I don't have to, all the things that I didn't particularly like doing in life, I didn't have to do anymore. And so I had absolutely no trouble following the vows pretty much perfectly, you know.
It's a very difficult thing to do. Not so difficult when you're in a monastery, but in general for a Westerner.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm not that great at it here, but but that was then, you know. That was somebody with a lot of enthusiasm and energy.
Yeah.
I trusted this so-called voice.
Inner voice. Yeah.
And so I disrobed and flew back to Canada and got a job, and then started contemplating, what do I need to do to grow up? What does that mean, you know? So I contemplated a lot of different things, like maybe becoming a school teacher, or opening a bookstore with some dharma stuff in there. But I wound up living in a house with a group of university students. Two of them were were thinking about going into medicine. And because I was older and wiser, they would come to me every evening to talk about the merits of doing that. And I'm now late 20s. And I went to 3 different universities, a total of 6 times. 3 times I finished the year, and 3 times I dropped out. So to contemplate something like going into medicine, there's absolutely no chance you'd get in anywhere. You're too unstable, you know. And then I developed a medical emergency, and I had to have surgery in the back of my nose. And about 5 times I wound up back in hospital having lost half of my blood each time. And they would pack it again, and I'd be in there for 3 or 4 days, you know. So one day I was lying in my bed, and the ear, nose, and throat surgeon came in with his retinue. I sort of looked at that and I said, I can do that, you know. And so the bleeding stopped instantly and never recurred. And my interpretation was, you know, the universe had first told me in silence, then whispered, and now it was shouting. And I finally got it.
So you found your calling in the mundane world.
Yeah, but I was too old, and I had a very unstable background and so on. So there's no way I was ever going to get in. So I did a bunch of tests, testing myself in various ways. And every one of the tests I passed easily. So I went back to university and in Edmonton. I got perfect marks. And I applied to the medical school and I didn't get in. So I went and talked to the vice president and he said they have a system where they assign you to different groups. And then each group has a number of people that they let in from that group, you know. Mm-hmm. And I was in a group, and I said, and how many people from that group do you let in? And he said, 0. Mm-hmm. And I said, is there any way I can move to one of the other groups? No. So absolutely for sure couldn't get in. Mm-hmm. Once again, I heard a voice. It was a little different voice. It said, don't worry about it. You will get in, absolutely guaranteed. I did one more year of pre-med, and then I got accepted in about 10 places, you know.
Wow.
When I was in medical school, there was a famous psychiatrist who was doing a sabbatical there. And he had given a talk many years ago about exploring inner space, because everybody was talking about exploring outer space. Mm-hmm. And this was a major lecture to the British and American medical associations all at the same time.
Oh, wow.
What he said in that talk was that we should start exploring meditation and other things to see if they are somehow a benefit in medicine and psychiatry. Mm. And so when he heard about me, having been a monk, he approached me, and the result was that a group formed, of which I was the head, mm-hmm. to do meditation research. At that point, I still wanted to awaken, mm-hmm. and that was my primary thing in life. So the medical school actually offered to create a department to study meditation with me as the head of it. Yeah, and I turned it down.
You turned it down?
Yeah. But basically, I lived in the world for about 30 years, and when I meditated in Thailand, it was very easy to get the impression that you're much more advanced than you really are, because the things that trigger your arisings aren't happening.
Right, yeah.
And so it turned out in my particular path that the way to get in touch with the arisings was to live in the so-called cold, cruel world.
Yeah.
But then deal with them mindfully. Yeah. And gradually work through them, you know.
Yeah. Rather than just try to run away from them or escape them.
Yeah, yeah. And there are techniques in meditation called dredging, where you can get in touch with these things even if the triggers to make them happen aren't there. Mm-hmm. But I hadn't been taught that at that time.
Right.
You know, and so if I would have stayed meditating in Thailand, I pretty much had found a way to safeguard all my attachments and not bring them not bring them up, so I never worked through them, you know. Mm. So living in the world actually for me was a great way to work through attachments by letting them come up and then dealing with them mindfully.
So at some point then you left worldly life again. Was that when you became mature enough?
When I was meditating in Thailand,
yeah,
I could sense there was a collection of energy somewhere in here.
Yeah.
But I couldn't access it and I didn't know what it was. In the mid-1990s, I had a much different body than I have now. And I used to ride my bike 2 hours a day to control my diabetes. without medication. I was living in Nanaimo, which is all hills, and I was coming down this gradual hill. And as I was coming down the hill, reality completely changed. And the universe became one. I hadn't been meditating, formal meditation. I had been practicing mindfulness all the time. But the universe became one. And with that, a great calm. And I got to the bottom of the hill, and on the corner where I was going to turn was a junior high, I guess you'd call it, or middle school, whatever they call those now. And it was a Friday afternoon, and they had just let out. And there was a collection of like 13 or 14-year-old boys who had finally got out of prison, and now they want stuff to happen. And they were waiting for their bus, and there was some gravel there, and they were throwing rocks across the road, right in the path that I would ride into. But when I came to the corner, I had a realization that there's no way the universe will throw rocks at itself. And so I turned right into their path, and I was laughing like a madman. I really was a complete madman. And just before I got to where they were throwing the rocks, there was a loud noise behind them, and they all turned to see what that was. And I rode by laughing like a madman, and of course, they never threw a rock at me, So at that time, I was married, and my wife had a spiritual interest, but she didn't know what it was and in what tradition. And so I had accumulated, over the years, I had quite a bit of teaching in Christianity and Sufi and other things. And so I had a really good library of high quality books in all traditions. And so it was our practice after dinner that one person would go and pick 3 books at random.
Oh, right.
And we would sit on the couch, and we would open them at random and start reading. And 2 things happened. One thing was one of the 3 would give you really good dharma advice about whatever was going on with you that day. Happened every single day. And the second thing was that you would see that allowing for the difference in the terminology and the language, everybody had the same aspiration.
Right.
And so we did that every day. And so that night, one of the books was Tibetan Buddhism, and the other 2 weren't. And up until that point, I sort of regarded all paths as equivalent. It's just that in something like Buddhism, the methods of what to do are clearer than in some of the other traditions,
Yeah.
So when we did the reading that night, my wife did the reading, the energy of that experience of the universe being one was in the Tibetan reading, and it wasn't in the other 2. And so that happened every time we had a Tibetan book, but it's at random, so we didn't have it every day, That energy would be reflected, and it wouldn't be in any of the other ones. And so it occurred to me that maybe, having met the Karmapa so long ago, maybe it was time for me to look into Tibetan Buddhism, And so as I started contemplating what to do that, that energy that I had mentioned, that I had noticed in the 60s, started to become very, very, very noticeable. So in those days, my health was very bad, and I could only meditate for about a minute. So, and I mean literally a minute. So my practice was, I would practice mindfulness all day, every day, and all night if possible. But as far as formal meditation, when I went to bed, I would sit on my pillow and meditate for 1 minute. And I actually found ways to get quite a few insights in that 1 minute.
Wow.
And so anyhow, I started contemplating what this energy was. And when I would contemplate what it was, my mind would become filled with thoughts of, gaining some insight and then helping beings and then taking rebirth over and over and over to do that.
Bodhisattva path.
Yeah, but I didn't call it that right then. It was just in generic terms,
Mm-hmm.
And so then I would look at myself, a guy who can meditate for a whole minute, It just looked like some ridiculous ego trip to think I could ever do that,
Yeah.
So in the meantime, I had met Situ Rinpoche.
Okay. Yeah.
And I went to see him one time in New York in a retreat. And there was about 180 people doing the retreat, plus the 40 staff at KTD. And he was interviewing everybody.
Right.
So the interviews were 6 minutes long. They'd get a group of 10 in an ante-room, and then you'd go in one by one for 6 minutes each, and he would do that hour after hour after hour, And the instructions were very clear. He will ask you questions. You are not to ask him any questions. The purpose of the interviews is for him to figure out where everybody is so he can adjust the level of the teaching.
Very skillful.
And I desperately wanted him to ask him to be my teacher. I had made contact with Namgyal, and he wasn't really doing interviews much at that point. He was pretty old at that point. Mm-hmm. So I had 3 really important questions that I couldn't get answers from anybody. And so I heard that he was asking people, what do you want to get out of this retreat? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And one other question. And I really wanted him to ask him to be my teacher, but I wasn't going to be able to ask a question. So I went in and I sat down. He said, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. And I said, okay. So he asked me the first of my 3 questions that I had wanted to ask somebody, and then he answered it. And then he asked the second of my questions and answered it. And the third question was, well, what about this energy and, basically wanting to be a bodhisattva and so on. So for the third question, he says, what's your aspiration? So I said, well, it's to attain some realization and start helping beings. And then basically I went on for 20 minutes, like the whole thing. And he gave me this divine smile and said, that's wonderful. That's the ultimate aspiration. So who better to get confirmation from than Situ Rinpoche,
Yeah. And famously, he can read minds as well. So.
Well, of course, yeah. So then we're now 40 minutes into my 6-minute interview.
Yeah.
There's a whole room full of people just on the other side of the wall waiting to get in.
Wondering what's going on.
Yeah. I basically figure it needs to come to an end pretty soon. So I just shut up. Mm-hmm. And he becomes quiet. And we sit there for another 5 minutes without a word being spoken. And he leans over and he says, you must have a question you want to ask me. Please be my teacher. Done. And then the interview was over.
Did you continue to receive teachings from Tai Situ Rinpoche after that?
Oh, yeah. And once he stopped coming to North America, I would go to India every year, usually take a group. Mm. And then I was looking after my mother, and she died in 2010. So then I was sort of free once again to contemplate what to do, and obviously I wanted to be a monk. So I went to see him for that.
Oh, that was only recently then, last
2010.
2010.
Yeah.
Okay. That you took robes in the Tibetan tradition.
Yeah.
2010. Well, it's been really wonderful talking to you today. And I have just a request to make. Could I come back and continue our interview at another time?
Absolutely.
Because it seems like you've got a lot of wonderful stories, and I think everyone on the channel will be really interested in hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, sure, that would be fine.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, bet.
And to everyone at Ultimate Meaning, The Theory of Samsara, then we'll see you next time.